So, in all honesty, the story of the Magi is a very odd story. It's kind of awkward, truth be told, and in order to cover up that awkwardness of the story, we often have our manger scenes or our children's pageant where the Magi show up just like the angels and shepherds on Christmas Eve. After all, that's what the story tells us. Unfortunately, that is not what the story tells us. In fact, one reading from the Gospel of Matthew of this story kind of puts to bed a number of things we assume about the Magi. First, that there were actually only three of them. There is only no indication that there were three, and the only reason we think there are three is because we sing, "We Three Kings of Orient are," just like we did this morning. Or because there were three gifts. There is no indication that they were royalty or kings of any kind. Magi referred to wise people. And I know this is maybe too startling for you. There's no indication that they were men. I know. Shocking. So it's an odd story for that reason, and sometimes we try to cover that up by our pageants or singing that hymn. There's a sense in which it is kind of a strange story. And tradition has made it so that we can kind of come to terms with the awkwardness of that story, because the truth is that most scholars seem to indicate, most biblical scholars believe, the Magi probably didn't arrive to visit the child Jesus until 2 years after his birth. Part of that is the evidence that Herod, in the text that follows this, had all children 2 years and under killed, trying to capture and kill Jesus. So, I try not to, truth be told, I try not to have tradition get in the way of a good story, and this is really a very interesting story. In part because it's the only time this story is told in the Gospel of Matthew. And what's interesting about Matthew, if you're not aware of this, in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew arises out of, it was written probably by someone who was part of a Jewish Christian community. More Jewish than Christian, to be truthful. It was written to a Jewish Christian community. Now, we should remember in these days the rise of anti-Semitism, that Jesus was a Jew who followed the laws and rituals of Jewish faith, and that the earliest Christians were Jewish. And so Matthew is significantly part of this Jewish Christian tradition, and he's trying to explain who Jesus is to these Jewish folks who are trying to integrate who Jesus was into their own faith tradition. They were trying to understand it. Matthew's the one who has the Beatitudes, or trying to portrays Jesus as a new Moses. But what's interesting is that this story, which is inserted after the birth of Jesus, is the most non-Jewish story in the first few chapters of the Gospel of Matthew. In part because this story Matthew has put here indicates that this birth of Jesus, while not recognized by the Jews around him, were recognized by these Magi who came from a foreign country. So Matthew's saying, because what's happening in the early Christian community is not only are Jews being attracted to the light, to the star of Jesus, but there are Gentiles, there are foreigners, there are the different kind of people who have been attracted to this star, to this light of Jesus, who come from very far away. It isn't just Jews who saw the light. It was especially, Matthew wants us to know, those outsiders Those people you'd least expect to see the star. And they're the ones who follow the light. That's an important point for Matthew. The important point is there are different kinds of people who seek the light, who follow the star. Now, I would propose to you this morning that one reason you are here is you've seen the light and you've seen the star and you want to follow it. One reason why you have gathered here this morning is that in some ways, much like the Magi, somehow that light of Christ, that star, has attracted your attention. You know something meaningful is there. And so you gather, hear and worship and sing a beautiful music and listen to a boring sermon because you seek the light and you want to follow the star. Now, in my imagination about the Magi, one of the questions that's not answered, and maybe can't be, but one of the questions I've always struggled with this, why is it that they saw the star and no one else did? Was it that the star was out there shining bright and people were just ignoring it? Or was it that they could recognize this particular star as powerfully, meaningfully important? What is it in them that attracted their attention to this star? I wonder if it was always there, but they were the only ones who paid attention to it. The light. And I wonder, I imagine, were they the kind of people who every day would look up and look for the light? Or was it just they were going along in their lives and the light kind of flashed, the star appeared, and somehow it pulled them towards it? That's an interesting question for me, and a challenging one in particular, because the truth is, these days it feels like we live in a very dark, dark world, doesn't it? We live in a world, it seems like, dominated by darkness. I mean, the unrest, possible war in the Middle East. It's not that we ask the question whether another mass shooting will occur. The question for us is when and where. It's pretty dark. Australia's on fire. And we're in such denial about climate change that we're pulling back on environmental regulation. The world is very dark, and it's hard to see the star. And yet, people do see the light even in the darkness. Now, I'm going to tell a tale on Bill Lloyd, because last Sunday I preached on the text about the massacre of the innocents. And I raised the question of who weeps for the children. And I particularly highlighted some statistics in our own country about children and the high percentage of children who live in poverty and the challenges that it seems like that we have to wrestle with if we're going to be followers of Jesus to address child poverty and the violence against children. And Bill, to my surprise, actually listened to the sermon. And he texted me afterwards, and he texted me a link, and I got his permission to say this. He texted me a link, and in the link was this article in the New York Times that said 2019 was the best year ever. And the reason is more children around the world left poverty than entered it. That the reality is that more people are getting connected to and achieving and coming out of extreme poverty than ever in the history of the world. And another church member, I didn't ask her permission, so I'm not going to tell who it was, texted me and said she had read a story about a woman who'd sacrificed her life for her child in some atrocity occurring around the world. What both of them reminded me was, there is light. There is a star that shines. And our job, like the Magi, is to follow it and come to that light and give everything we have. Right? Now, it's hard to know what the light is. It's a scary world. Let's be truthful. But there's one line in there that kind of gives me a hint when we recognize that light, when we see and realize that there is that star shining. And that line in this text it's just a simple line in which the text says, they saw the star and they were filled with joy. So I think you have a hint. You know the star, and you got to look for it and see it. And maybe it's shining all over, and we're just now noticing it, or maybe it kind of catches our attention or something. It's when it brings you joy, you know you're following the light to the incarnation of God in this world, to the baby Jesus. So, one last example. Yesterday I was with some members of this congregation, meeting with some members of Trinity Presbyterian Church in Indianola, and we were talking about the environment and things we can do as churches to be more engaged environmentally, and things that they were doing, things that we were doing, ways we can raise our intention about sustainability and our fears about climate change, and what we as followers of Jesus can do in the midst of that. It was a very engaging, interesting congregation, but someone mentioned to me something I was totally unaware of. Who here has heard of Fairfield, Iowa? Oh, well, y'all are much more aware. But Fairfield, Iowa is practically 100% sustainable. Because back in 2009, I Googled it a little bit, back in 2009, they made a plan and a commitment that they were going to make their city sustainable through wind energy and solar, through policies and procedures. Fairfield, Iowa, a town of 9,000 people, made this choice, and now, to me, the light of Christ shines over Fairfield, Iowa. You are called to follow the star, to seek the light, to always, each and every day, point to that star and light in the darkness. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.